We're going to go back in time to the 1990s and build ourselves a dial-up ISP. Yes, back before broadband was a thing. We weren't all permanently connected to the internet. We had to dial it up, which is basically we plugged one box into our computer and it screamed down a telephone line at another box. So we're going to build ourselves a dial-up system, which is going to give me a nice excuse to go over the technology and the history of this thing. Now, there's a particular reason I'm doing this video now, because this time next year, this video may not be possible, as here in the UK, our major telecommunications company, BT, are about to shut down the operation of POTS phones, i.e. the old-fashioned analog telephone lines that we all used to have at home. BT is going to start offering voice over IP services only, which, to be honest, modems do not work very well under, as they're designed to compress voice data really well, but that compression is lossy. So modem signals tend to get damaged and corrupt when they come back out the other end of the compression algorithm. So I figured, if we're going to create a dial-up ISP, we better do it while people can still, dial us up. I should mention this video is sponsored by PCBWay. I know, right? I'm as shocked as you are. Who would have thought this little channel would be sponsored, but it is. PCBWay make, unsurprisingly, PCBs. And they also do 3D printing and CNC milling as well. Basically, you upload your designs, and the results come back in the post. Obviously, you have to pay them as well. As this is the first time I've ever had a sponsored video, I feel like I should point out, this sponsorship isn't going to change anything about the channel. PCBWay don't have any control over what videos I make, what the content is, what I say about anything. They're just here to sponsor it. So I mentioned PCBWay. Man, you don't know how hard it is not to pronounce that, PCBWay. Right, back to our regular schedule. Now I'm going to go over some basic phone stuff because not everyone was alive when dial-up ISPs were a thing. Traditional telephone lines are designed to do one thing and one thing alone, and that's get a voice call from one place to another place. And it did that essentially by doing something called circuit switching. It would essentially join a number of lines together in a row to get you from one phone to the other phone, establishing a circuit path between the two devices. Your analog audio call would then essentially pass along those lines as an analog waveform. Now, it did get a little bit more complicated than that, especially as more users came onto the network and multiple calls between exchanges started to share the same copper line, using frequency shifting techniques. Phone lines don't carry the full spectrum of human hearing. After all, we don't use that whole frequency range for speech. What became the settled on standard was that it would represent from 300 Hz to 3.5 kHz, which is why phone calls sound a little bit, different to normal human speech. In fact, I'll just give you a quick clip of me talking with that frequency limitation on us. Hello, hi, this is a telephone. Yep, that's me talking with everything turned down from 300 Hz and below and everything after 3.5 kHz. And it's into this space that modem manufacturers had to start operating. Modem stands for modulator demodulator, as that's basically what a modem does. It takes a binary stream of data and modulates a sound wave to represent it. It also listens, takes inbound sound wave and demodulates those back into digital. The first ever commercial modem was released in 1958 and created by AT&T, known as the Bell 101, which was very quickly replaced by the Bell 103, which boosted data rates from a whopping 110 bits a second to 300 bits a second. Man, that was not rapid. The 103 remained essentially the standard modem all the way through into the late 70s. And in fact, pretty much all modems that still exist now, they can still do the 103 standard. Bizarrely, it's even still in use for shortwave radio broadcasts. Yes, it's still used by radio hams today, and there are even still commercial services that broadcast the current time in that format as well. By the time we're into the beginning of the 80s, things are starting to change for modems. The first big thing that happens is Hayes releases its smart modem. Now, up until the smart modem, when you used a modem, you literally dialed the number you were going to want with your phone, kind of like this. You then take your phone and you place it in a cradle so the modem could then hear what's going on, and it would just start, essentially, having the 103's type conversation. If you happen to pull the handset out partway through, data would drop, and as soon as you put the handset back again, data would continue, with no recovery of the data in between. The Hayes Smart Modem, that allowed the computer to actually control the modem. And it introduced what is now known as the AT command set to do this. So, for example, ATDT would use tone dialing to dial a particular number. This also meant that your Hayes-compatible modem could be plugged straight into the telephone line. You didn't need an actual telephone on there that you did the dialing with, because the Hayes modem could. ATH, for example, hung up the phone call. ATA answered an inbound phone call. ATI told you a bunch of information about the modem. Now, this is how all modems now work, as you can still buy new modems. Now, around the same time that the smart modem command set was becoming quite popular, modems were starting to offer different speeds to just the 300 bits a second standard from the 103 and the 1200 bits a second standard that AT&T had established slightly later on. But having different standards meant modems had to start negotiating between each other. After all, they had to agree which set of standards each modem could support and then pick one between them to have the conversation at. Now, this led to the familiar sound patterns all of those who used modems during this period will recognise, this beginning of the conversation. Now, you see, it starts with what's known as the carrier detect tone. That way you can tell you're actually talking to a modem. You can also use that carrier detect tone to work out, has the line dropped? And then there are essentially a bunch of training tones where the two modems try to work out what speeds they support. Once this training period is over, our connection is established and data can transmit between the two devices. The carrier tone keeps going all the way through, just so we can check if the line's dropped or not. Now, all of these faster speeds had to live within that frequency restriction we were talking about earlier, the 300 to 3.5 kHz range. So this severely limits the amount of data a modem can possibly move. Now, these techniques let us get all the way up to 33.6 kilobits a second, which is close to what's known as the Shannon limit for the line. Now, you may have noticed all this development in modems is starting to take place before the internet at home is really a popular thing. And that's because they're being used, well, not for the internet, but to dial up other services. For example, a fair few companies would allow people to remotely dial into their networks or machines. Individuals have also started setting up bulletin board services so you can connect up to them. Even have a period where computer companies start their own dial-up services, for example, Apple. And you start to get walled garden services like CompuServe or AOL, or in the UK offerings like Prestel, or in France, Mintel. All of these services fit very well around the circuit-switched nature of dial-up. You dial up a service, you use it, you hang up, you dial up another service. Every service you dial up is fully self-contained. However, in the worlds of university and the military, something is afoot. They've started to use something known as the internet. Now, the nature of the internet is very different. Rather than being all circuit-switched, it's packet-switched. Each individual device connected to the internet releases IP packets. Each IP packet has a destination address, and the network gets that IP packet to the right destination. Never a circuit set up and torn down to move data. It's always individually addressed packets of data. It's into this world where we have the internet and we have dial-up services that ISPs first start to appear. And this is where we're going to start building our little ISP. To build our ISP, we're going to need a minimum of one modem. And for this one modem, I was going to use my trusty old US Robotics modem. Only there was a small snag. I couldn't find a power supply to my US Robotics modem. So after doing a bunch of setup, which we'll come on to in a second, I ended up surrendering on this modem and getting a new little USB-based one to fill in instead. We're also going to need a modem to test that this dial-up ISP works. And for this we have the modem I accidentally bought for £1. Yes, I was taking part in Dudley from Yesterzene's Quid Game series, where we were supposed to buy a game for £1, and I accidentally clicked on a bid £1 for a modem, and won a modem, so I'm going to have to make use of it. Just briefly while we're on the subject of Dudley from Yesterzene, why not go check out the Yesterzene channel? I'll even include a link in the description below. I mean, don't go right now. I mean, stay to the end of this video, then, why not go check out Yesterzene? Anyway, back to the ISP. The other bit of kit I have here is a telephone line simulator. The reason for having this is I want something to pretend to be the telephone line while I'm testing this thing. After all, I don't have two telephone lines to try it with. Yeah, which brings me on to using modems in general with retro computing. Most modems, you can't just link the telephone line connectors on and essentially send and receive together. Modems expect a few signals from the telephone service. Quite a few, for example, expect there to be a dial tone. Now, some will ignore this and just say, no carrier, but you can still tell it to dial, and then it will connect up. Of course, on the other end, you have to manually tell it to answer. But you'd also need to rig up a circuit supplying voltage. As telephone lines actually work on something known as a current loop. Essentially, your telephone line provides a voltage and your phone fluctuates that voltage and loops that back out of the line again, and that's how the audio signal is encoded. This line simulator provides all of that. It provides the dial tone, it provides all the current loops necessary, and also, if you press this switch, it makes the phones ring. So this gives me everything I need to pretend to be a telephone line and to test this service with. So, on the ISP end, I need myself a server, and for this purpose, I'm going to use this here Raspberry Pi, because I have a lot of spare Raspberry Pis. Now for the purposes of this, our Raspberry Pi is being a bog standard Unix box, which is how most ISPs did this back in the day. Now, I'm not saying exclusively, some smaller ISPs may well have used Windows NT for this purpose, but Unix was pretty much the standard approach to doing this. I mean, there's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, Unix by default supports the idea of logging in over a serial port, for dumb terminals and the likes. So that means we had a built-in system for handling modems and also doing usernames and passwords. The next thing is, thanks to BSD, most Unixes also had an IP stack, and had one for quite a while. I should briefly mention before someone starts posting away in the comments. Windows NT, not the only alternative for Unix for this. I did know one ISP that used the PDP-11, for example. I mean, they didn't offer anyone a fast connection on that PDP-11, but they used the PDP-11, and they wrote their own handler for modems and an IP stack in concurrent CP/M. Now, given you have BSD Unix available for the PDP-11, they really took the hard road on this one. Now, the Unix setup side of this is pretty easy. First of all, we have to set up a Getty for our terminal. Getty programs are what Unix and in fact Linux still uses today to provide terminals. Now, this is either ones connected to the serial port, or the virtual terminals you get on the console of the machine when you're not running X Windows. Commonly for the virtual terminals, Linux used to use a program called agetty, although systemd's probably eaten that functionality by now. But for our modem, we're going to use a modem-aware version of a Getty called mgetty. So all we have to do is install mgetty, like so. We don't need to tell systemd not to start a regular Getty on the modem, so we just mask that out. And then we tell it that we want to start mgetty on that device. Once that's all done, we have mgetty sitting and listening on the modem, waiting for an inbound call. So we'll quickly use our phone simulator to simulate the ring, and our modem will detect that ringing tone and start issuing the sentence ring ring across the serial port multiple times. mgetty will see that and will answer the modem with ATA. Now on the remote machine during the dialing, we will see that we get the Unix logon prompt. And here we can use our username and password, and we'll get connected up as a regular Unix terminal over the modem. Now, that part's not ideal if we want to be an ISP, because all we've got here is we've got the user to a shell prompt. And no ISP really wants someone shelling into their Unix box. No, at this point, we want to start another program rather than the command shell. Now, there were two popular options back in the day for this, SLIP and PPP. SLIP, standing for Serial Line IP, was probably the protocol that was in most use earlier on in the world of ISPs, but it soon very much gave way to PPP, so for this we're going to use PPP. In fact, PPP is still in use for modern broadband to this day. So we'll log ourselves out of this session and hang up the telephone. Now mgetty, being modem aware, detects that hang up and sees the no carrier signal, which means it knows the next time it answers the call it needs to spit out the whole login prompt again. In order to fire up PPPD when the user logs on, we need to change the user's shell. So first of all, we're going to create a quick wrapper script. That script is going to be the thing that fires up PPPD. And we'll save that script in user local spin for the time being. And then we edit the etc shells file. That allows us to add that script into the list of valid shells available for users. Because if our shell is not in that list, when a user logs on, if it has a shell that's not in the list, it just gets logged straight back out again as a security measure. So once it's in etc shells, we then update etc password and change the user's shell from bin bash to our new PPP script. I will quickly mention this isn't the only way that authentication was handled. When PPP completely took over and ISPs weren't offering SLIP anymore, authenticating in the way that you could launch a shell script, well, that became a bit less commonplace, as PPP has a mechanism to do authentication directly using PAP or CHAP, and mgetty supports that with its auto PPP option. What mgetty does is it listens to the beginning of the LCP frame that tries to configure PPP. If it detects that, it fires up PPPD itself, and PPPD authenticates the user. If it doesn't detect it, then it drops to normal login prompt, and your regular chat script can run and get you authenticated that way. Now at the client end, I'm going to use Windows, as by the time Windows 95 came out, we had full dial-up support built into the operating system. Prior to this, you had to install things like Trumpet WinSock into Windows, which did the whole providing you with an IP stack and handling the dial-up side of things. Now, our dial-up script has a couple of standard things you'd expect to be there. We have the telephone number of the ISP we're going to dial, our username, and our password. And also, there's something called the chat script. Now, Windows did ship with a standard chat script. And what the chat script's there to handle is the initial serial logon bit of getting into your ISP. So the script, for example, expect to see login as the first thing. You can see we've avoided using the word login itself because we don't know if it's going to use capital L or lowercase l, which is also why the second part of the script looks for #word. Now the reason you can edit this is not every ISP used the exact same bit at the beginning to prompt for the login, and also some would give you a menu after login so you could choose things like PPP or slip, or do you just want a terminal into their bulletin board. Some ISPs would actually give you a floppy disk that's got a dial-up profile on it, so you could just choose to use that and wouldn't have to set any of this stuff up. And then there was the likes of AOL, who issued more CDs than there were people on the planet, containing their big fat weird dial-up client. With all this now set up, we can tell our computer to go online. And here you can hear the sounds that everyone who used the internet back in the day remembers hearing. And about 20 minutes into your internet experience, the following scene would also occur. Now, what we got set up here is really not that dissimilar to how ISPs of this period worked. Admittedly, we have just one modem, so we can only support one user dialing up at once. But you can imagine, with more serial ports, we could just attach more modems. And in quite a few ISPs, that's literally what they did. You had multi-port serial cards in the box, and you connect them up to, well, shelves and shelves of modems. Some were a little bit more sophisticated and had rack mount modems, which is essentially a 2U chassis with a series of modem cards in. For each modem card, there was a serial port on the back to link it up to the Unix box. And either a whole bunch of connections for telephone lines or one big fat Amphenol connector that all the telephone lines came in on. In fact, many years ago, I got hold of a box that had belonged to Demon Internet. Now at this point, Demon Internet, when they turned up in a new area, would either rent or buy themselves a house, they'd bring in an X21 lease line to bring it back to their central network point, and they'd install a couple of rack modems and a box that contained essentially a number of multi-port serial cards and a card to handle the X21 line, and that was a small dial-up pop for that area, so you could ring it up using a local telephone number. In fact, there was one not far from where I grew up, and a friend of mine who was in the police told me that they got all sorts of calls about that house. As with it seeming to not have anyone living in it and had the windows blacked out, people assumed all sorts of crimes were going on. It was reported to them as a knocking shop, a growing house, so a fair few times my friend found himself having to go around there and talk to semi-disgruntled neighbours and trying to explain that no, they discovered that it was in fact an ISP, and then spent quite a while explaining what the internet was. One of the things I really like about this point in time is more or less anyone could set up an ISP. You didn't have to be a big corporation or need a huge loan to set one up. All you needed was to be able to afford essentially a PC, some modems, and a connection to the internet. This meant a lot of ISPs sprung up. Many of them just served one small region where essentially they were the only ISP with a local rate number in that area. Others were big national ones. So for example, you had ISPs like South Yorkshire Online, which guess what dealt with South Yorkshire. There was Cityscape. Then you had the big national ones like Demon and Pipex and Clarinet. Some of the smaller regional ISPs like PlusNet grew out to be big national ones eventually. Same with Zen. And in this period you could enter the industry at more or less any level and grow. Now, I should mention, dial-up ISPs are not quite like modern ISPs now. They're expected to provide something a little bit more than just the internet. Back then, your ISP would also provide you with things like an email account. And usually it'd be whatever your dial-up username is at thatispsdomain.com or co.uk. Many ISPs also provided web hosting in with your monthly fee. And again, typically you'd be that ISP's domain name / your username, or your username dot the rest of that ISP's domain name. Some would even let you register your own domain name and bind it to your own web space and have a few email addresses at that domain name too. And this, your ISP also provides your basic other internet services thing. Well, that stuck around for quite a while. It took us well into the broadband era before specialist companies emerged for doing things like hosting email or providing web space for you. And of course, in the 90s, everyone had to have their own personal homepage. Now, some of the really observant amongst you will have noticed when I was talking about modem speeds, I did not mention 56k. In fact, you'll be able to spot people in the comments section who spotted the whole 56k thing, but didn't watch the video until this point where I covered 56k. And they'll all be telling me, why did you not mention 56k modems? Well, now I am. I'm also going to mention ISDN as well at this point. When I described earlier how telephone systems worked, I maybe used a more old-fashioned and simpler explanation for how things operated. Partially because this video isn't about explaining how telephone systems work, and also that description was true up until about the mid-70s into the 1980s, at least in the UK, because slowly across the country, British Telecom, who were then our embedded telco operator, had started to change all their exchanges from analog switching to digital systems, largely using Plessey's System X. Now, this changed the telephone model from one that used pulse dialing to tone dialing for a start, but also it fundamentally shifted how things operated. Your telephone line to the exchange operated as it pretty much always did. There was still a current loop, and it still fluctuated the voltage, and that's how things operated. But when it got to the exchange, in the exchange switch, there was now an analog to digital converter that took your analog signal and turned it into a digital signal. That would then be packet switched over a network to another exchange somewhere else that would then use a digital to analog converter to get the audio onto the line of the person that you were calling. By the early 90s, BT had rolled this out across the entire country, and a similar thing had happened in most other major countries too. Now, this represented a problem for those trying to create 56k modems, as when the analog signal reached the exchange would not do the best job of converting it to digital, as the modulation needed was pretty close to the sample rate of the exchange. This means by the time it got to the receiving modem, the audio was distorted and, well, yeah, it didn't work. Now, obviously there was a solution to this problem because, 56k modems were a thing, and the solution to that problem was ISDN. Now, even if you lived through this whole period, you could have gone your whole life without being aware of ISDN in any way, shape or form. Because in the domestic space in most countries, ISDN barely made an impact, except for Germany. In Germany, ISDN did really well, but that's, to do with reunification, the fact that 50% of the country needed its technology base completely replacing. ISDN stood for Integrated Digital Services Network, and was a purely digital telephony service. It was still by and large circuit switched, like traditional phone systems. Okay, I do know about the whole frame relay thing, I just really don't want to get into it here. And it allowed you to place both voice and data calls. In fact, I've got an ISDN telephone here, you can see. Unsurprisingly, it's a German ISDN telephone. This gave companies that were working on potential 56k modems a solution. As an ISDN phone could ring a regular POTS telephone, this meant that the whole phone call was digital all the way up to the local exchange, where it would then get converted to analog. Because the sound was presented to the telephone system in a digital format, when its little digital to analog converter ran, everything was perfectly in sync. This meant you had no issues with the audio being of a similar frequency to that of the maximum that the sample rate could support. So in short, our audio didn't get corrupted. The next part of the solution was on the analog side. You simply didn't have as much bandwidth coming from the end user dialing the ISP as you'd have coming back the other way. As that side now stayed well away from the max the sample rate would support, there were no alignment issues. And this for the first time means that we had an asynchronous connection between user and ISP. You could download at a faster rate than you could upload. This however created the first major technological shift for ISPs. With previous improvements in modems, they'd just been able to, replace their modems. They kept the telephone lines, they kept all the serial connections to the box that ran them, they just, changed their modems over time. Well, with 56k modems, they wouldn't be able to use their analog lines. They'd have to shift over to ISDN. Now, ISPs had used ISDN before in some cases, and they used a device that looked very much like a modem. In fact, lots of people did refer to it as an ISDN modem, only it doesn't deal in sound. It would actually make essentially a data call. But the things did look like a modem box, and they did support the AT command set, so I can see why people called them that. But those were usually one or two small devices in an ISP connected up to basic rate ISDN lines. And those devices would not be capable of terminating 56k modem calls. No, for that, a whole new class of device was created. There were two major vendors of this bit of kit. Firstly, there was Livingston and its Portmaster range that would get bought by Lucent to make the Lucent Portmaster. And then there was also ASEN that made its Max range of kit. Now, as you can see, these boxes look very different. They essentially take what's known as a primary rate ISDN line. Yes, there were two types of ISDN line. Basic rate, which is the kind of one you get at home or in a small business premises, and that had two 64k channels that could be used for data, and also an extra channel that was used to control the ISDN line. And then you'd have primary rate ISDN that had 30 channels of 64 kilobits. And again, a slightly bigger control channel. Well, at least those speeds are accurate for Europe. Inside the US, those speeds are a bit slower because they use a fundamentally lower frequency to base everything on. Now, these boxes also arrived at the time that ISPs needed to, consolidate down the amount of equipment they were using. The internet had become a lot more popular, and the number of modems and lines you needed was exploding. and at 2U for every 16 modems, yeah, it was taking up a lot of space too. Now, this is where these boxes really helped, because one of them could say take one primary rate ISDN line, or two primary rate ISDN lines. Some even went up to 4 or 6. And with each ISDN line carrying 30 channels, well, that really consolidated down the amount of equipment an ISP needed. But this is where I need to point out that this technology was really disruptive to the ISP industry, because these boxes, they cost a lot. If you're talking dealing with a minimum of 30 lines to start with, that's going to be an expensive box. And it meant that ISPs would essentially have to throw away most of their modems and their analog lines. This is where many small ISPs just exited out the market at this point. They couldn't afford the new equipment refresh and, well, they found other more profitable things to do. I'll come back onto that later when we start talking about business services. But for the big players and the more medium-sized of the smaller players, this was a pretty useful change in many ways, but also it did hit bank balances fairly hard. With the change to this kit also came the introduction of a new technology, one you may have heard of: Radius. Radius is in fact still with us and is used by ISPs today for authenticating broadband connections and also by Wi-Fi. What Radius let us do was authenticate users who were dialing up and also send back information like should they use PPP, what their IP address is, that sort of thing. And this was very useful because these boxes, they did not connect via a serial port to a Unix box. Oh no, they had their own Ethernet port in it and would drop the traffic onto either 10 or 100 megabit Ethernet. So they did need some form of external authentication system, and Radius, well, that was the answer. Radius also provided our accounting details so we could see when people had logged in, how long they'd been on, and when they'd hung up. You could also use the Radius protocol to terminate sessions as well. This again made life a little bit simpler for ISP administrators, as we no longer needed users on a Unix box to equal ISP users. And that saved us with all the weird difficulties we had with synchronizing users between different Unix boxes that we were terminating the PPP connections on. We could also soon start using Radius to authenticate our email users and FTP access into websites as well. Not too long after the creation of Radius, Free Radius came into existence as a project. And that version really flourished and is in fact still in production today. Now we've got our ISP built, it's time to get someone who isn't me to dial into it. I'm going to plug this modem into a real telephone line, and I'm going to hand over to friend of the channel, Mr. Johnny Blanchard, who's going to dial up our ISP.
It's my job to dial up to John's dial-up service, and that proved to be a small problem because I don't really have machines that have modems. So my newer one here, the only new machine I've got, that is way past the time when we had modems, that hasn't got one built in. My other machines tend to be things like MSXs, which didn't even understand the concept of modem really, apart from a few tiny ones at the end. So I haven't got any for that, but fortunately I recently received this, which is an NEC PC98 machine running Windows 3.1. There's no internet on it, but it does have a terminal dialer, so we can use that to log in. Now there will be some screen rolling because I don't have a fancy camera that can match the frame rate of the screen, so there will be a little bit of flickering, but you should be enough to see what's going on. Yep, so here we are. Now this is the dial-up program. It's in Japanese, of course, because this is a PC98, which is a Japanese machine. So we just hit dial, and that will dial John's number. Oh, and there's that lovely the ringtones, and then in a minute, there we are, the caterwauling. That brings back a lot of memories. Oh, there we go, we are connected. John's welcome message there. So if I log in, so I am J Blanchard, there's a bit of lag obviously, we're going over a phone line. And my super secret password. And there we go, we are logged in. There we are, and there we go, we have a README file. Which I imagine is what we see on the screen there. So there we are logged in over the phone line to John's fully working dial-up service. I'll hand you back to John himself.
Well, there we go. Thanks very much, Johnny. We have proved that the ISP does in fact work. I know everyone here knows how the world of dial-up ISPs ended. Yes, we are in fact waiting for the asteroid that is broadband to come wipe us out. But before we do, yeah, there's one more major change in the ISP industry we need to have a little chat about. Now, I'm going to talk about this from a very British perspective because that happens to be the one that I know best, but a similar story did play out in other countries across Europe. I don't know if so much in the US, but certainly across the rest of Europe. This next challenge to the ISP market was a lot more about the economics of things rather than the actual technology. In the UK, our state telephone company, that was the GPO, had been spun off and privatised to become British Telecom, and this introduced competition into the telephone market for the first time in the UK. Similar things also happened in many other European nations too. And in this model, your telephone company, the one you chose, would charge you for any telephone calls, but also it would get charged by other telephone companies that terminated calls for it. This meant suddenly there was money to be made in receiving calls, particularly for the telcos, which meant as telephone companies competed with each other, they all sought to attract large destination telephone numbers to their network. So for example, call centres and of course, ISPs. This led to the situation where telephone companies were willing to offer some of the money they made on receiving inbound calls to the people who are at the other end of the telephone line, the ISP. The other significant change in the telco market that was happening at the same time was that the march to digital exchanges had meant that calls between exchanges were cheaper than ever before, which meant that the likes of BT was able to offer a local rate national number. These 0845 numbers were charged at a local rate to the person dialing the number, and yet could land anywhere in the UK. These two changes were about to create a massive shake-up in the ISP industry, as previously, small local and regional ISPs had managed to stay in business because phone calls to them were cheaper because they were the only local rate provider. Some national ISPs like Demon would set up a point of presence in a particular location so they could have local numbers as well. But because they were forced to be distributed for this, they could never bring their economies of scale to bear. This meant they could never really dominate over the local ISPs. Local rate national numbers meant that a big ISP could then start to concentrate its network and start to bring economies of scale to bear. The other part of this was the economic model on which ISPs operated. Every customer would pay their ISP a monthly fee for the right to gain access to the network. On top of that, customers would then pay their telephone company for the phone calls that they made to the ISP. Thus, local rate calls save people a lot of money. But with ISPs starting to get a kickback, well, the model could change. And soon in the UK, one company changed it. That company was FreeServe. The model FreeServe introduced was that you would pay no monthly fee, you would only pay for your phone calls to them, the ISP. FreeServe would make its money from the revenue it generated from the inbound calls. Now, FreeServe was started by Dixon Store Group, a fairly large operator here in the UK that operates a number of electronic retail stores, including Dixon's, Comet, Currys, and PC World. They joined forces with Leeds ISP Planet Online to create FreeServe. Later the whole thing would be purchased by French telecom subsidiary Wanadoo. FreeServe really upended the financial model for most ISPs, and its model of free at the point of use really did seem to appeal to people. Suddenly people stopped paying their £10 a month and switched over to FreeServe, which created a bit of a crisis in the ISP industry for everybody else. It also didn't help that FreeServe was owned by Dixon Store Group, who, if you're buying a computer in the UK, chances are you're probably buying it through one of their stores. And on the counter, next to the till, was a big old pile of FreeServe CDs that someone would helpfully point out exist and say, "Why don't you try these? They're free." This is where a bunch of ISPs disappear out of the market. Smaller regional ones had maybe seen the changes coming and had sold themselves to larger ISPs to be their regional pop. Some of the established regional ISPs, the likes of PlusNet, were one of the first to decide to change business model. They would also shift eventually to a FreeServe type model, where they ditched the idea of the monthly payment and you just dialed up and paid your telephone bill. Other ISPs, well, they decided to diversify and change the business that they were operating in. And this is where I'll come back to this thing I mentioned earlier about the business ISP side of things. See, plenty of small regional ISPs have been dealing with businesses and helping with their email and with their web presence. Now, most of these companies had some form of IT service provider that was more of a desktop support kind of provider. They'd help you with office packages and Sage and accounting stuff. They may even set up the odd file server for you. But when it came to the internet, yeah, they were a little bit lost at sea, and businesses turned to their ISP to help them set up things like corporate group mail servers and get that stuff actually working. This soon meant that some local ISPs were making more money from those business services than they were making out providing internet in the first place. So when FreeServe turned up, well, their domestic customers disappeared off, but their business customers, they remained dialing up, collecting their email over ISDN. And those local ISPs, they just kept servicing that consultancy and support demand that had built up. Sometimes these ISPs would merge up with a local desktop support company, and we'd see these businesses essentially turn into IT consultancies with a bit of internet on the side until eventually broadband appeared and the bit of internet on the side, that stopped being a thing. Soon though after this, the giant asteroid that was the broadband industry arrived and wiped out the dial-up industry in a couple of years' time. Some ISPs successfully made the leap from dial-up to broadband, and others just vanished along the way. Soon the technology that underpinned dial-up ISPs will disappear from the UK and many other countries, with ISDN due to be shut down in the UK next year, with plain old POTS lines following fairly shortly afterwards. Now if you're watching this at home and you're one of the few people who are still using a landline telephone, don't worry, you'll still be able to use it. It's just, instead of the telephone line working in the old traditional way, BT are going to provide you with a little box that turns your telephone call into a series of IP packets. Yep, your phone call is going to go over the internet. Now, some of you may realise a POTS telephone line can do something that a modern broadband connection, or indeed a mobile phone, can't do, which is keep working in a prolonged power cut. A thing the UK has had no shortages of this winter, as various once-in-a-100-year weather events that appear to happen multiple times in a single year now, happened. These events in some cases have led to hundreds of thousands of people not having power for days on end. And if in that event you can't make an emergency phone call or ring your electricity company to find out when you might have some electricity, well, that's not a good thing. Some of you may be thinking, I can just keep my mobile charged, right? I've got one of those recharging batteries, I can keep it going for a few days. And yes, you might be able to. Unfortunately, your mobile operator has not put a sufficient quantity of batteries in the mobile mast, and that doesn't work anymore. Now you might think with the impending switch off that somebody might be doing something about this, and all the evidence would point to, no, they don't appear to be. It would seem BT's kind of going gung-ho on this one because, well, it saves BT a lot of cost, and politicians are not realising there's much of an issue. You see, your average MP probably doesn't know that BT is turning off its analogue services because it's not exactly been well publicised. I mean, have you seen it in the news? And also, your average MP doesn't understand a lot about telecommunication and how it works. They probably assume their mobile would keep working. But there's a lot of people who told us who had power cuts this winter, yeah, no, they don't. So at some point, I'm hoping POTS either gains a reprieve or that mobile operators get some form of requirement placed upon them to keep operating in emergency conditions. Now, if anything I've just said in the last few minutes kind of alarmed you a little bit, yeah, I mean, it probably should a tiny bit. And if you want to write to your local MP to say, hey, there's this impending problem, yeah, that may not be the worst idea. Well, if you've made it all the way to this point, I'd like to say thank you very much for watching. We've learnt about the history of dial-up ISPs, we've made a dial-up ISP, we even got poor Johnny to dial it. So it just remains for me to say thanks to Retro Princess for lending us her acting talents, and also thank you very much to Johnny Blanchard for recording that section for us. I might also suggest perhaps you could go watch all of their channels after this, and of course Yesterday, who I mentioned earlier. If you enjoyed this video, why not click that little thumbs up-y thing at the bottom, because that apparently really helps people find the video. And if you want to talk about ISPs with us, well, there's the comment section below. And as ever, I'd say if you're feeling very kind, why not subscribe? Because that makes a huge difference to whether YouTube can be bothered telling people that these videos actually exist.